right, we're back, and I am Ron Keefe Jr. here with my father, Ron Keefe Sr., really telling the story of his family growing up in South Boston during some pretty difficult and interesting times. Dad, you were one of, as we mentioned before, really technically 17, although really only 12 who
Survived.
really survived. And we've talked about your life, we've talked about your mother and father, and now we're going down the line of each of your siblings. We've covered Joseph, who we all know as Sonny, Francis or Frank, who we all know as brother, and then Alice, who we all know as sister, and we are now at my uncle Davie, David Joseph, born December 10th, 1926, and again, the fourth child of your parents, Joseph and Alice. And I've been excited for the Davie episode because I have a lot of great memories of Davie. He was always around and an amazing storyteller and a really, really interesting person. And I know you've got just a ton of stories. We'll probably have to break Davie up into 2, maybe 3 parts. Similar to brother, I guess.
Yep.
But different
Right.
in a lot of ways. So, Dad, tell us about your brother Davie.
Okay, I'll start off by telling you about when I was growing up, the stories I heard of Davie. At what age, I'm not sure, but Davie fell off a horse and wagon, I guess in the 30s. And I know when I was growing up, the Iceman and the rag man, they used to have a wagon, they used to have a horse pulling them through the streets, and they would yell ice. And people would come out and raise their hand, and the people would come in with a chunk of ice, put it in the ice box, and charge them a dime or a quarter for the block of ice they gave them. And Ragman you'd call them and say, how much for all of this old clothes? And they'd say $2 or whatever. And so there were horse and wagons on the streets of South Boston. And I gathered Davie and a couple of his friends were on when they were young, and I don't know how young, on the back of one of these wagons. And the wagon turned the corner, and Davie fell off, and the wheel of the wagon caught his head between the curb, which caused him to be deaf and it cracked his, but he was deaf in one ear. And right now I don't know, I can't remember which ear it was, but he was deaf in one ear, and that's important in a couple of stories later on. Davie was extremely tough growing up. And Davie was short, 5'5"-ish, 5'6", and he was always angry about, in my opinion, about being short. And stories of him getting in these fights was legendary. I would say he almost never lost a fist fight, and I guess he had a lot of them. But I guess as he got into his mid-teens, he went into boxing, and he would be like, on the undercard at some fight night. The fights were big in Boston in those days, and he was a boxer, and he'd also work as a sparring partner for guys who were coming in, to big time guys, sparring partner. And there was a boxer who got a big fight lined up in Boston. His name was Willie Pep. and he was a 5-time world champion in Davie's weight class, which is probably 130, 140 or something like that, I don't know. And he came to Boston, they had a big fight set up. They had a big thing going on. And so Davie signed on as a sparring partner, made like, I guess, $5 a day as his sparring partner. And Davie tells a story that they were about the same age, and they had their helmets on, and they told Davie they want Davie to attack Willie Pips with body punches, so they could learn to block the body punches, no headshots. And Willie was just going to be on the defensive. So Davie and Willie went out and they started sparring. And Davie was throwing shots at his body and Willie was blocking them. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, bang, 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 Willie hit Davie across the head 3 or 4 times and staggered him, and everybody jumped in the ring. You know, and Willie said, "Oh, I'm sorry, kid. You know, instinct. You know, and Davie, being a boxer, understood. He said, so, okay, you know. So we went back to the sparring, and I was throwing the body shots. And Willie was blocking him again, and then all of a sudden, after 2 minutes or thereabouts, bang, 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 again across the head. And Davie said, hey, you know, what the hell's going on? Tell me if you're gonna, you know. And everybody's, oh, you know, kid, you know, it's like, you know, you're a boxer, you know what it's like. You know, you try to do this and this and this and that. You know, the old body takes over and you start throwing shots. Davie said, okay, but you know, come on, knock it off. Let me know if you're gonna, if you want to spar, we'll spar, but don't do this. And he, you know, so back to the 3rd time, and Davie's throwing body shots. Again, and Willie Pep, bang, bang, bang. And Davie said, excuse my French here. Davie said, you little guinea bastard, and picked him up and threw him into the corner and put his hand on his chest and started pounding Willie Pep in the face. And Davie could throw a shot. And the handlers came over the ropes, grabbed Davie, threw him off the, you know, like out of the ring. He was worried about Willie and his big world championship boxing match that had been set up for months and months and months, you know, with Boston Garden and something like this, you know, and then they came flying off of the, a couple of them came flying out of the ring, grabbed Davie, grabbed his clothes out of the locker, threw Davie down a flight of stairs, threw his clothes down, threw $5 down, and told him he'll never be a sparring partner again for Willie Pep. But Davie said he would have killed him. But that's the way Davie was.
Did Davie have aspirations as a potentially?
Davie used to box. He used to box on, you know, like 4-rounders and so on. Those were prelim fights.
Yeah, and he get paid?
Yeah, I mean, he got, you know, he didn't get if he won, he got whatever the winner's purse was for another card fighter.
Yeah.
But he made a few bucks. And he used to go along shoring with his galleys down on the docks. And World War II broke out.
Yeah.
And Davie, like all the other guys around, they went and joined the military. Well, Davie gets in line, and the medical doctors, I remember my physical, I was in line, and you'd step forward and the doctor would put the stethoscope in your chest, make sure you had a heart, put on your back, make sure you were breathing, check your ears. Somebody would hold a card up and say, what all the colored dots on it and say, what number do you see? And it was one of these color blindness. He passed all the tests. He passed all the tests except when it came to hearing. Let's say it was his left ear he couldn't hear out of. So when they checked his right ear, they said, okay, turn around. So he did a complete 360 or 380 or whatever it is, and came back to the right ear. And the doctor hesitated for a minute and looked in his ear again and said, turn around. Now, turn to the other side. Davie did the complete circle again and came back to the same ear. And the doctor said, stand there. And the doctor walked over to his left ear and looked in his left ear and saw that Davie couldn't hear. So he got rejected from going in the military.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, I heard that he joined the Merchant Marines, and he used to when the ship was built in the Quincy shipyards, or wherever else the shipyards were in Massachusetts, these Merchant Marines would sail it down to New York City. And New York City would do what they did by, loading troops onto it or supplies or whatever. But Davie would come back, and that's, what he did. Even though there were German submarines off the coast, he said that's one of the things he did was, after the ships were built, he was one of the merchant seamen who would be on the boat. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what he told me once. That's because he couldn't get in the military.
And to be fair, I mean, he's born in 1926. The war breaks out in late 1941. I mean, he's not even 16, really,
Right.
when the war starts. He's barely...
17-ish when he did this.
Yeah, I mean, the war's over by 1945, so it was probably the tail end of the war.
But like that, everybody who could was... I'll tell you a very quick story. Well, he was what you called 4F, which is, I forget what 4F letters stood for, but it was a designation the military would write down, Dave Keefe 4F. And that meant he was disqualified from all 4 services, probably, I don't know. So he was considered 4F. Which a lot of guys didn't like that connotation because they wanted to go, but they couldn't for whatever medical reasons. In Davie's case, he couldn't hear out of one ear. Well, I had a cousin. We have a cousin named Billy Austin. He was 5'10", a big, strong, very strong guy, tough as nails. Him and Davie were just a menace if they got in a brawl with other people. And neither one of them was shrinking violets. Well, if Davie were deaf in his left ear, Billy was deaf in his right ear. So when Davie and Billy walked together or talked to each other, they always stood right ear to left ear so they could hear each other. And both of them tried to get in the military. But they were both classified 4F. There were other reasons why Billy couldn't get in, which I'm not going to get into, but he was the nicest, sweetest guy in the world. He had hands like twice the size of my hands. You could tell he had been in a few brawls in his life. Well, Davie and Billy were walking down Broadway one day, and the Fargo building used to be loaded with Swabbies. The Navy was in the Fargo building all the time. And there were about 5 or 6 Swabbies in their white uniforms walking up Broadway. In front of it was then Gorin's, the department store. And Davie and Billy are talking to each other, right ear to left ear, so they could, and one of the Navy guys split them between them. purposely walked right between them and said something like, 4 Fs, 4 Fs or something like that. So Davie said, and Billy said, what did he call us? I don't know, but I think he called us something bad. So they turned around and they gave the guy, they said something to the guys in the Navy. So there's Davie and Billy and these 5 or 6 Navy guys jawing on Broadway in front of Gorin's, and whatever, it turned into a brawl. And this was during the time of the war. And in very short order, Davie and Billy had beat the hell out of these 6 sailors, threw one of them through the Gorin's plain glass windows on Broadway, and he was he was lying in with all the mannequins. And they just did a job on these 6 Navy guys. Then they took off. I gotta remember, they were only young guys themselves. And sure enough, cops asked around, who the hell did this? When they finally called the cops. Who the hell? Well, everybody knew Davie in Southie, I gather. And Billy came from down on Baxter Street, so at any rate, the cops knew very quickly it was Davie and Billy who would beat the hell out of these guys. So they grabbed them, brought them to the 6th House police station, and told them, they're not going to prosecute them, they're not going to charge them. It was one of these misunderstandings, but that Davie and Billy were not allowed on Broadway for the duration of the war. So if they had to go from Dorchester Street to D Street, they couldn't walk down Broadway. They had to go down 5th Street, 4th Street, or 6th Street or something. They banned them from Broadway for the duration of the war. And but these 2 were thick as thieves. And Davie was, we'll go back to the Columbus Tavern we talked about earlier.
So the Columbus Tavern, by now your family lives on East 8th Street.
Now we're up on East 8th Street.
And the Columbus Tavern
And the Columbus Tavern was the local family men's bar.
Right across the corner from...
No, right on the same corner as
Right
us.
on the same corner.
Yeah, you come out of the house, take a left, walk up 40 yards, and there was the Columbus Tavern. Walk 40 yards to the right, and there was Galata's. So, but Davie hung out in the Columbus Tavern. And many nights I would have to, we had a phone in our house, and my mother or father would answer the phone, and they'd say to me, if I was sitting there or somebody else, but it was usually me, go tell Davie there's a phone call. So I'd walk up to the Columbus, open the door, everybody in the place looked to see who was coming in the door. And so I'd stand there and everybody was looking at me, and I put my hand up to my ear, and that meant, Davie, you have a phone call. And he'd say, yeah, we right there. Well, this one time I opened the door, and I see Davie streak about 4 steps and hit 3 guys, 2 of them with 1 punch each, and one of them had 2 punches. So in 4 punches, he knocked these 3 guys out in the middle of the Columbus Tavern, to the extent that one of them, when he hit him so hard, the guy passed out, backed up, was flying backwards, and he was out cold, and he landed on the table where the old guys were playing dominoes. The dominoes flew all over the place, and they just slid the guy off and let him hit the floor, and then they picked the dominoes up and continued playing. Now, all three of these guys were bigger than Davie. Okay, and my jaw dropped. And he looked at me and said, "What do you want?" And I gave him the hand signal to the ear. He said, "Rawr," and I stood there paralyzed because I had never seen anything like that in my life. And he came out and went by me. And it was usually some girl would come by, 20 minutes later, half hour later, and pick him up in her car outside of Columbus.
What was the story behind why Davie had to beat those guys up?
Well, those at the Columbus, as I said in the past, you had your seat. Your father stood under the TV. You stood in the middle. Your son was at the end, and everybody had their spot. Al McCurran, which is a friend of Davie's, which is a pathetic soul, I gather he worked or whatever. I don't even know if he worked. But he'd sit at the bar nursing dimes all night long, shooting the breeze with all the guys. And when these three guys came in, they needed 3 seats at the bar. There were 2 seats. There was a seat next to Elmer. So they pushed Elmer off of his seat so they could have 3 seats. Well, when they put their hands on Elmer and pushed Elmer off, Elmer was not about to defend himself against anybody, but Elmer was a friend of Davie's. So when the one guy pushed Elmer off, Davie came off the chair to defend Elmer, and 4 punches later, those 4 guys were being dragged out of the bar. I never saw anything like him in my life. But he was as tough as you could get. He also was very athletic. He played football in those days. I never saw him play, but Park League football. He played softball for the Columbus Tavern. All the taverns used to have their own little softball team. They'd play in this league down in Columbia Park. And I would go over and watch Davie play, and he could play. He was an athlete, on top of being a fighter, a boxer, on top of being a brawler, on top of everything else. But he had another problem. He was a drinker. And when he got drunk, he could be mean in his own right. And Davie didn't particularly like tall people. And as I said, I was 15 years old and I was taller than everybody in the family except my father, probably. But I was taller than all my brothers and sisters. And I was an honor roll student, which Davie was brilliant. He was a very smart guy. But I might have shown my arrogance a little bit. When I was young. So on top of being taller, I was an arrogant SOB. I have no idea how far Davie went in school. But Davie always had a book with him. Was always reading some book. He always had a book in his back pocket. And he would read everything in sight. Really smart. And on one occasion I was in the house and I think Ma went to bed when she saw him come in knowing he was drunk. And I was sitting in the living room and he sat down. And I got up to go out and he said, "Sit down." So I sat down and he explained to me, as drunk as a skunk as you could get, the entire water system of the city of Boston. How we come from the reservoir out in Western Mass. And how we went through all of the treatment plants on the way to Boston. But he described everything, and it took like 45 minutes. How we got there, I don't know. I didn't ask. He wanted to talk about it, we talked about it. We didn't talk, I listened. But he was really, really brilliant. And he was a very good friend to his friends. And he was very friendly with Joe Moakley. And growing up, he had a group of friends that played softball, football, like all young guys in Boston at the time. They weren't gangs, they were just guys who hung around together. But Davie was one of the most unique guys. Smart as a whip, had a great vocabulary. When he was drinking, he could get very mean. He could get meaner if you were taller. And later on, we'll talk about Freddie. But Freddie and I used to cross swords almost every night. But when I would yell at Freddie about, it's not your television, that we're going to change the channel, whether you like it or not. And because I was bigger, I would change the channel. And Jackie would egg me on just to egg Freddie on. And Freddie would then run to Davie and tell Davie, that big moose, he was picking on me all night long. I couldn't even sit and watch television. And the next time Davie got drunk, he'd come up and say, what are you picking on somebody small? I'm smaller than you. You pick on me. See how far you get with picking on me, you big ass. And he would threaten me all the time.
Poke you with his finger.
One night he did poke me. He came in and he poked me a good 30 feet down the hallway and threatened me. But I was smart enough never to raise my hand, even to scratch my nose. I wouldn't dare raise my hand because I didn't know what he would do, but because he was drunk. And he was angry because Freddie had told him what a big bully I was, and but he was in the Union. He loved the Edison Union. To tell you a very quick story, the Edison went on strike.
Why don't we do this? Let's stop here, because we're
Yep.
going to have to do at least one more part on Davie, if not
Yep.
more. So I'm going to just stop the tape, and
Yep.
we'll come right back, and then
Yep.
we'll pick up with some more stories about Davie.
Yep.